Welcome back to episode 84 of the PHP Town Halls. Here lies dynamic properties. They were good properties, Brant. If you get that reference, send me a tweet, send Ben a tweet. If you don't get that reference, then I don't know if there's any help for you, to be honest. Anyways, along with Ben, I'm joined by Colin Odell, who you may know from the internet on Twitter, and he is the maintainer of Common Mark, which is the default and probably most popular markdown library out there for PHP. Colin, how's it going?
Going pretty well. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, how's life?
Things are pretty good, man. Just golfing and fighting with Phil about how much that destroys the environment. It's been a fun time.
Is there have you figured out like how bad it is for the environment?
No, but also it's Phil, so like everything's horrible.
All right, so now that we've gone out, he's gonna bitch about us on Twitter, isn't he? About how we're giving him
He's
a
like
hard
our
time.
one listener. We just talk shit about him constantly.
At least we know we have a listener. I mean, look at what was that conference we were all just at, Longhorn, back in October? I saw
Back
Taylor.
3 weeks ago.
He didn't even mention offering to give me any money for this podcast. How many times did I hit him up? I mean, for real.
Maybe we should set our sights on Phil.
We should, but I don't think he has any money to give us. So,
He'll just give us
anyways,
a tree.
we don't need. Actually, I do need some trees. Anyways, so we brought Colin on. As you may or may not know, in the PHP world right now, the biggest kind of, I don't want to call it, well, it was drama around an RFC, which we haven't had a lot of lately. It's actually been pretty common. So this last one was the RFC proposed by Nikita, which was to deprecate dynamic properties. What this means, if you really have not been paying attention at all, so let's say you have a class, a user class, and it has a public property name. You instantiate the class, new user, and let's say you typo name to Nane, N-A-N-E. Behind the scenes, PHP doesn't care, and it will just instead dynamically create that property on the class. So you'd have user arrow N-A-N-E. Obviously, once you figure out that that's not name, you go back and fix it. But to PHP, it doesn't matter. It just takes what you give it, runs with it, creates a property from what you type in, and then it just continues on doing whatever else it needs to do throughout the request lifecycle. Nikita proposed that coming up in 8.2, we should probably start moving this functionality, for lack of a better word, out of the core. And so Nikita proposed that in 8.2, we would still allow dynamic properties to be set, even if you did type of them, but we would at least raise a deprecation warning with a full error exception in 9.0, which following the last PHP release cycle was 7.0, we'd have 8.2, 8.3, 8.4 most likely, followed by then 9.0. This has created a lot of I don't want to call it strife amongst the community, but has caused a lot of people to take sides either for the pro or the anti RFC side of this one. Colin was kind enough to volunteer and say that he was pro this RFC. So I guess the first thing, Colin, is why, like, what about this RFC do you think is a good idea?
I really like that this RFC aims to continue the evolution of PHP into a language that has a lot of sensible defaults and a lot of default behavior that isn't surprising to people. I think if you're new to PHP and you discover that, hey, you can just attach random properties to any object and they happen to work, I think that can be a little bit surprising. I think it makes a lot more sense to have classes where the properties you define are the only ones that can exist. Otherwise, if you're adding random properties to certain objects, those properties won't exist on all instances of that class. And I think that can lead to some really bizarre behavior. And it can also lead to people potentially abusing that, using or abusing, depending on your frame of mind there, where you can just sort of attach any data you want to any object. And there's really no strong contract guarantee that that data is going to exist given some instance of that class. So that's kind of why I'm for it in a nutshell.
So, I mean, I get what you're saying with you can kind of do whatever you want to. There's no contract. I mean, that kind of, as someone who kind of came up with the solid principles, direct property manipulation is always kind of like one of those things you probably shouldn't do. Instead, you should have getters and setters. So I guess to play the anti role, and in full disclosure, I really have zero, I don't really have an opinion on this. If it goes away, it's fine. If it doesn't, it's fine. But if you had getters and setters with proper type checks, wouldn't that kind of alleviate the need to deprecate the dynamic properties?
In a way, yes, especially if the rest of your code is using that and you don't do anything that really pays attention to whether or not those other properties exist. That's certainly a valid point. I think there are also some valid use cases where it is helpful to add dynamic properties. We've seen some CMSs like Drupal, for example. The Drupal views system likes to use dynamic properties so that in your views, you can use these objects that have things like a name field attached to an object, and you can kind of build up those list of properties on demand dynamically. That works really well for those systems. I think one of the things about this RFC that I like is that users who need that can still continue to do that. They just need to add this one annotation to the classes that are going to continue to leverage that behavior. So there is this, opt-in approach where you can still keep that existing behavior if you need it, but it's not enabled by default, and it's implicitly kind of discouraged unless you really need that.
So with that annotation, because I did read that you can opt in with the annotation, though, when it comes around to 9.0, can I still opt into that dynamic property accessibility, or is 9.0, it doesn't matter, it's gone anyways?
As of today, the plan is that if you have that annotation added to your class will continue to work with dynamic properties in 9.0. However, there is this unanswered discussion about whether or not that should change in 9.0. Should we go towards completely banning that and not allowing dynamic properties at all? Is that something that should wait till 10.0? Do we really want to do that? That is kind of an open-ended question. And I think that kind of gets to the central point of that strife and that conflict, is whether or not it makes sense to completely remove that feature from PHP.
Yeah, I guess that's the main concern I have with it, really, is probably just the annotation, right? Like, I would almost rather see us dive right in, right? Like, it's deprecated, it's going to be deprecated in 9. You go ahead and get the flag, and that's just it. That's kind of where you are, rather than this attribute thing, right? Because it's like one more thing to consider. You still have to keep all the logic in the actual source of PHP to still support this. So if we still technically support it, we're now just enforcing the way our users use it, right? Like, feels like a weird middle ground to take. And then maybe we do fully remove it in 10 or something like that. But I don't know. Just feels like a odd rollout plan for me. A lot of variables.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. I do think that it is kind of a compromise, because there are other ways you could continue to have dynamic properties or functionality similar to that, such as using the magic get and set methods. You could extend from std class if you wanted to do that. That is going to continue to support dynamic properties. You can extend that. So there are these other options out there that do seem a little better in the long run. I think the compromise with the annotation is that for people who don't want to, or maybe feel like they can't do that, the solution is as simple as just adding essentially what looks like a comment onto the code. But of course, we know now in PHP 8, they're not comments anymore.
Yeah, it would be interesting to I don't think I know any code bases that actually do a lot of this. I'd have to like dig through maybe old coding editor stuff I did, right? Maybe there's some huge code base that did it there. It'd be interesting to see what that looks like, right? Does it actually help you much to have that annotation? Is it more work to add the annotations than to fix the code? That sort of thing.
Well, I mean, Symfony leverages annotations all over the place, especially with doctrine and stuff like that too. And I mean, it's never like a bad thing to have them. I never totally understood the why behind it, but it wasn't. If anything, it just made the classes longer because you had those massive doc blocks, which to some people like the visual debt community, I get that, but it's definitely not the worst thing about having them around.
The visual debt community. We should make a T-shirt that says that. But no, so I wasn't referencing annotations as a bad thing in particular. I was referencing dynamic properties in this case, right? Like a code base that uses a lot of dynamic properties.
I mean, I understand, like, I understand the reasoning behind it. Like, because it's kind of like what Colin's saying. Like, if there's no contract against what you can and cannot add, and if I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing and I just dynamically add something to an object and send it back over the wire to a front end client, if I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing, I might expose a API key or some sort of secret token. Or if the front end, thinking back to like the open API, if my client is expecting certain fields and I send them back typoed fields that have the data, there's going to be a broken amount of trust there between the client and the provider of the API. Because when I say I'm going to provide a user object with name, phone, email, and birthday, and I send name and phone, phone, I've broken a contract, therefore I've broken the trust. Therefore, the consumer may not ever want to interact with my APIs again, which has long-term consequences as well. So I get it. And then I also get it, I guess, from the other side. And the other side really seemed to be not angry about it, but against it because of from the open source maintainer's perspective, which is it adds a lot more work to the already mostly unpaid, mostly thankless job that they have to do. And I mean, Colin, Common Mark is, I think, north of 10 million downloads, something like that these days. Like it's up there. I mean, you're probably one of the more.
My background, 64 million.
Okay, well, yeah.
Do you have like a physical counter behind you? I don't know any details about that.
I do. It is very far away, and I'm not going to be able to bring it over, but I can absolutely find a link to a picture of that and all the information behind it. Not to go too far off on a tangent, but it's a little Arduino with an LCD display that counts up the downloads in real time.
Nice. Well,
I've never seen the blog post. Yeah, that was pretty cool. But so, I mean, like, that was kind of the biggest con I saw is like open source maintainers who are already having to do a lot of work just maintaining their libraries. Now this is something kind of being dropped on them. Is that like, as an open source maintainer, like, is that something you're feeling as well with this upcoming deprecation, or is it kind of overblown maybe?
I do get the sense that it might be a little overblown. And I mean that in the best possible way. I think maintainers are legitimately concerned about what the impact would be to them and to their users. This change was not going to affect me on Common Mark. There was another open source developer in the internals email who was raising some of those concerns, expressing concerns about what's going to break. I'm going to have to update all these files. They ended up checking out a nightly snapshot of PHP 8.2, testing their code, and they found out that it actually didn't break anything. There was a third-party library that did break, and it needed that annotation. They didn't do... I don't think they found exactly what needed to be updated, but they suspected it was just one or two files that just needed that one-line annotation to fix things. I will say, with 8.1, there was a similar annotation that I did need to add to the Common Mark project. I forget what it was called and what it was about, but it had to do something with the fact that I think we were implementing like iterable or one of those iterator type interfaces that doesn't have a type signature for the return method, for the return value. And we were applying our own to it. And we had to add an annotation to make PHP errors kind of shut up and go away. But even that, it was just one line of code, one small annotation. We got that merged in, got that released quickly. It was a really easy change. Yes, it was a little annoying, but it was a super simple fix.
So, I mean, it almost just feels like people are almost against the change to be against the change, almost like this reading all of the Twitter back and forth. And I mean, of course, Twitter is a relatively small sampling of the worldwide PHP developer community, but reading Twitter leading up to the close of this vote, like I honestly thought it was almost like the type hints RFC from years back, where that really caused people to pick a side. But I mean, after kind of talking it more through with you, reading through both the RFC and a few of the comments on the mailing list, it almost just feels like people are just kind of against change.
I think that's fair. And I do think there is something to be said for preserving that backward compatibility and making it really easy to upgrade to new versions of PHP. If it becomes difficult to make those upgrades, people are not going to upgrade in time, and their software is going to fall out of date. They're going to become vulnerable to security issues. So I definitely think there is something to be said for that, maintaining that backward compatibility. But at the same time, I also think it's important that we continue to drive the language forward and continue to improve things and make it easier for new developers coming in. I think that this particular implementation in the RFC was an acceptable compromise, but I can certainly understand some of the reservations other people would have.
Yeah, that's fair. And I can imagine, if you're the type of the developer that really thinks PHP should stay dynamic in every way, it always has been, and you just see RFC after RFC kind of adding more constraints and type hints and enforcement, right? This is just one more thing on top of that pile that might make you against this.
Absolutely. And I think one of the strengths of PHP is that, at least for the last several years, it's supported different ways of programming. You can go completely procedural if you want to. You don't need to use types. You don't need to use classes. And that makes it really powerful and really versatile. If I'm creating an enterprise application, I can go, Symfony, latest version of Symfony, type hints everywhere, PHP 8.1. I see Matt giving me a side eye there at the mention of Symfony. But, you can opt into all those advanced features, or if you just need a really simple script to do something simple, just go full procedural, abuse the array functions, use arrays, not data classes, and you can get the job done. And, both work just as well, both solve problems. And I think if PHP can continue to maintain that balance, I think that's only a good thing. That's only going to help the ecosystem.
I mean, that is like a very delicate balance. And I mean, to throw another aspect out there too, in the Rant Slack that Ben and I are in, Larry Garfield is in there, and he's talking about using PHP to do advent of code in a purely functional programming style as well. So kind of like the two things that you're just talking about, procedural and enterprise style coding. And then you can also do functional programming with PHP as well. You can do pure scripting if you really wanted to just kind of write, line after line after line of programming. So, PHP really has struck a really nice balance of kind of accepting everybody, however you want to code, over the last, 4 or 5, 6 years. At some point, like, I guess the question, especially for the maintainers, is like, do you kind of just let the language not get stale, but kind of chill for a couple of years? Or do we keep trying to push it forward? And I think that's really where the divide's going to constantly come down no matter what feature we're talking about. But to
Absolutely.
also to throw it out there too, the other big internals news is that we finally have a PHP Foundation. This has been something that's been talked about for years. I know I was talking about it for a little while. Ben Ramsey was talking about it for a little while. What kind of stuff do we think this is going to allow the internals developers to like have access to? Like, is this going to be like the step in the right direction that everyone's hoping it to be?
So I'm pretty bullish on it. I think it's a great idea, right? That a lot of us have thought we needed for a long time. I think time will tell how much that actually bears through, right? Like, how much will they fundraise? How transparent is the org over time? And then does that encourage involvement? It seems, theoretically, it should incentivize involvement for people that wouldn't otherwise be able to get involved. And I like it, but I think we will have to let it play out a bit before we can say for sure that it's positive.
I agree with you, Ben. I think at least at a high level, at face value, I think it is great that there is a foundation being created and it is going to sponsor developers like Nikita to dedicate that time and effort into continuing to drive the language forward. I'm not entirely sure how, the whole governance structure is going to play out. How is funding going to play out? I do think, I agree with Ben. I think time will tell how that works out. But I'm optimistic. I think it could be a great addition to the community, having this foundation to really help push things forward.
Yeah, I mean, when it was announced, it really seemed to kind of take the internet by storm. I looked it up real fast. So far, they have raised $212,542. Just JetBrains is starting in a cool $100,000. Someone named Radka Bakova dropped just short of 25,000. Taylor Otwell dropped 10, and Private Packages dropped 18,000 alone. And that doesn't even count the thousands of people who have chipped in $5, $10, $15. $5 to us is, a week's salary to somebody else in a country that is not as fortunate as America. So seeing all these people kind of coming out, and I agree with you. I think it's going to be interesting to see how is it going to play out? How are they going to be able to get the money to the developers? Are they going to be able to maintain this fundraising over time? Like it's anytime you see fundraising, it's like it hits really quickly and then it starts tapering off the longer it goes. But I do think it kind of injected a little bit of kind of like positive vibes around the core, if that makes sense. Like the core was kind of dragging over the dynamic properties vote. It was just getting ready to release 8.1, so they're all tired. So seeing the kind of community rally around the core, which you don't really get to see all that much, because the core kind of lives in its own little world away from the Laravel people, the Symphony people, and all that kind of stuff. Like I felt really good about the effort coming out, and I really do hope that it maintains longer than just a couple of years.
Yeah, I think that and the governance will be really key, right? So, like, how do you decide who gets the money? What type of money do they get, right? And so, like, if you're a developer in the core and you're doing a lot of good work and you get $5,000 that year, like, that's nice, and that might help you justify the time a bit, but that's not a full-time job, right? Like, that's not Nikita spending every day working and thinking about these problems. And even if you have 100 developers getting $5,000 a year, I'm not sure it solves much of that problem, but if we have ways to really funnel it in and get, a couple developers working primarily full time on it, I think that would actually have a lot more impact than just a bunch of people with a couple hours here and there.
I mean, I think that's the hope is we can fund at least 2 or 3. I think reading the blog posts that came from Joe and Roman from JetBrains, I think ideally they want to find 2 or 3 contributors who are going to be consistent throughout the year. They're not just going to show up for the one feature that they want to get accepted and then kind of fall away. They're going to show up, kind of do what Nikita was doing. Was, just in case if you don't know, Nikita has decided to move on to LLVM core work instead of PHP core work. So we've lost our little robot boy. Yeah, he's gone. Anyways, we'll pour one out for him. But like we, and that's part of the other problem too, is, at some point the problems of PHP aren't going to interest you, which is perfectly fine. You're going to want to move on to something more challenging, more interesting, like Nikita did. And so we've got to be able to find a way to fund people who do find PHP interesting, and keep them around for longer than a feature, one PHP version, something like that. And so I think that's their goal, is to find 2 or 3 people, kind of get them into the, like, get money into their pockets so that way they can be working on the core. Ideally, I think part-time at first. I don't think there's any expectation that anyone could just immediately go full-time on the core through the foundation itself, but at least get it part-time in a regular kind of cadence with the core, and then try and figure out how to keep the funding going so that way we can transition more people into that kind of thing. So overall, I think it's a really good thing. We'll throw a link in the show notes if you haven't seen the blog post or a way to donate to the Open Collective. Definitely worth it if you can do it. No pressure if you can't, but definitely consider it. The other thing I think we wanted to talk about, Colin, was we want to unpack your Mac trauma, because you were a Linux person for the longest time, and you got a new job. You left Unleashed Technologies. You were there for what, 13 years?
13 years, yeah.
And you joined Wayfair with Ben. So sorry. It's terrible. It's literally terrible. And the worst part is they gave you a MacBook.
I know. It's absolutely terrible. No, it's been all right.
So,
it's been an interesting journey.
So on a scale of like 1 to 10, like, how offended were you?
I wasn't offended as much as I was disoriented, I guess. Like, I know how to open a web browser. I know how to type, gmail.com and hit enter and get to my email. But it's all the little things that just I don't know how to do on a Mac yet. As an example, if you want to open up a program that's not in your dock and you want to do it with your keyboard, what do you guys do? What do you hit on your keyboard?
Command space.
Right. On Linux, you just press the super key. Or command, and you get a nice little box that pops up. It's basically like Spotlight, which I just learned about. So you can search your apps, you can search your files, but it also shows you little previews of all the windows you have open. On a Mac, that's done through Mission Control. And I didn't know what Mission Control was. And so it's learning, where do I find these different features that I'm used to? What are these different shortcuts that I use? And wondering why the computer acts bizarrely when I try shortcuts that don't do quite what I expect.
So I will say, like, I always use Spotlight. Sometimes I also use Alfred. I don't know if anyone's told you about that app, but it's like a Spotlight on steroids, and it's really nice. It's good, but I always forget about it. But I never used Mission Control ever. Like, I forget that exists all the time.
I use it only accidentally. Like, I get a new Mac and there's some kind of swipe or something that turns it on, and I'm like, oh shit, what is this?
I mean, probably like the first thing I do when I get a new MacBook is like I download my dot files. The second thing I do is fix the trackpad, like the 2 and 3 finger swiping. So that way, like, I don't do Mission Control by accident or anything like that.
We could just turn this into like your favorite apps episode, right? Like iTerm 2. Make sure you check that out if you haven't. And Text Expander. Those are probably my 2 favorite.
I have to look into that one.
I mean, iTerm 2, Table Plus, and PHP Storm are like the 3 essentials for when I'm programming, and then I'd use Todoist and Bear as well to do like to-dos and just general note taking throughout the day.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, one app that I discovered recently is called, let me see if I can find it in Finder. Sensible.
Spotlight.
I just couldn't remember what it was called. Sensible Side Buttons, which allows mice that have, you know, the back and forward buttons to work on a Mac. With my setup, I have, I'm essentially doing almost like a KVM type setup where I have one monitor, one keyboard, one mouse, and I'm using the two different video inputs on the monitor and a USB switch so that I can have both my PC and my laptop connected to everything. So I'm trying to use my PC keyboard, my PC mouse on a Mac. Some stuff works, some stuff doesn't. One of the things I found out early on is back and forward buttons on the mouse don't work. So that was a nice little utility I found to fix that. I did, however, just order a new Mac-specific keyboard. So hopefully that'll come soon, and that'll get me more into the Mac ecosystem. As much as it's been a challenge to pick up Mac OS, I'm trying to dive into it head first. I'm not going to give up on it. I'm going to give it as much effort as I can bear, maybe, and we'll see how that goes.
Did you get the Intel or the ARM Mac?
The Intel. I got the 2019 with the fancy little touch bar that I don't use.
Yeah, nice.
Nobody uses the touch bar. Nobody.
It looks cool, but not only do I not use that like, keyboard, it's.
I use it. I mean, if I'm out and about, I'll use the touch bar to like control my volume on my headphones and stuff like that. But I never touch the touch bar when I have it docked like on my desk or anything like that. I don't see the point. I think it's dumb.
I never use it for anything that I couldn't accomplish with just static buttons that used to be there, right?
Yeah. I mean,
that makes sense.
Like, I've seen some cool, like someone did like the 9 cat to like through the little strip, and I thought that was.
Oh,
cool
you could
like,
probably have it display your download numbers.
Yeah, actually, you probably could.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to try that.
I'm surprised they gave. I mean, no offense. I guess like with everything that y'all are doing, because I know like Wayfair. I mean, y'all have all sorts of different programming languages going on. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised that they didn't give you the latest and the greatest Apple Silicon. Instead, they just opted for the Intel, which works across everything y'all are doing.
Yeah, think I'm on the pilot program, so I should be getting an ARM Mac soon. The trade-off there is then I have to fix everything I find wrong in the Wayfair ecosystem, which is probably a part-time job.
So Ben's going to be looking for a new job when? Just as Colin like gets hired, Ben's like, I don't want to fix this. I'm out. Peace.
No, man.
If you want, I have a really nice Linux laptop you can have.
Yeah, much easier.
Yeah. So I mean, Colin, what team are you on Wayfair? Like what are you doing there, and how is it going to differ from what you were doing at Unleashed?
Yeah, great question. So I am actually on Ben's team, on the PHP platforms team, just helping out all the other devs in the organization, work with PHP more efficiently, get things done faster, solve their speed bumps and roadblocks so they don't have to deal with that, and they can be 5x, 10x developers. Compared to what I was doing at Unleashed, it's definitely different. I think the biggest difference I've noticed is just the size of the organization. So at Unleashed, we were about 50 people strong. Wayfair, the technical organization itself is 3,000 plus. So just a completely different scale of people that we're working with, the types of problems we're trying to solve. That's definitely a huge difference. Also, going from being the longest tenured person at Unleashed to the newest employee of Wayfair, I'm kind of leaving all of that institutional knowledge behind and starting from scratch and trying to learn, okay, where are the CI pipelines located? How do I perform a merge request or pull request? Who needs to approve things? What's the next step to deploy things? And just picking up all those little bits and pieces. I feel like I have learned quite a lot over the last 3 days. It sounds like I'm doing about as well or slightly better than my managers expected. But, there's still a ton to learn, and just becoming familiar with all of that, I think, is the biggest change. On a day-to-day level, the type of work I'm doing is also going to be a bit different. So at Unleashed, I was recently the director of technology. Then I shifted over to principal engineer. And so I was working with a lot of different people all across the organization, trying to help them solve problems, which is somewhat similar. But I was also doing a lot of day-to-day development on some of our larger projects, doing some system design, doing some system administration, doing on-call rotations for our hosting department, doing a little bit of management. So this is definitely a big change in that regard. I see it as more of a focus on one particular area of expertise, and I think it'll be a really nice change of pace. Not to say I didn't like what I did before. I absolutely love Unleashed. Still love all the people there and what they're doing. But I'm really excited for this new chapter, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. It's also interesting too, because like when you get to the level that you're at, no one really thinks about like what does it take for you to change jobs and what is going to be different for you going forward. Like we always focus on the juniors being onboarded and how much work it's going to be for them. And I think the conversation could definitely benefit from more staff plus engineers talking about what does it take for them to get comfortable onboarding a new job, even with all the institutional knowledge that may or may not transfer over. You still have that knowledge, at least in a working sense, to know to ask those questions versus like a junior developer who may not even think to ask about CI pipelines or who approves a pull request or anything like that. So I think it's interesting to hear your perspective. And will be interesting, like 6 months down the road, a year down the road, like how you have integrated into that whole team.
Absolutely.
We talked about that a bit in the Rant Slack. If you haven't seen it yet, Colin, you should definitely check it out. There's a Rant Slack, and there's a staff plus engineers channel. I think we're both in it, right, Matt? And there's a recent conversation there about like it's almost impossible to go from being a principal engineer in one company to a principal engineer in the other company and still feeling like you're as productive or as valuable for quite a while, right? Because a lot of what you provide as a principal engineer is just a ton of context, and you have none of that coming into a new job, right? So in a way, it's a pretty big investment from a company to bring in a principal engineer that's fresh. A lot of times they're homegrown.
Absolutely. And I do think some of my skills that I have picked up over the years have served me quite well so far in my first 3 days at Wayfair. Just the other day, I picked up a ticket to edit a query in an application I've never touched before. And, I have the knowledge of how to clone down a project, how to get Docker up and running, how to figure out what is calling this query, where are the tests located, how do I get the tests up and running? Knowing that there is a Confluent space out there that I can go and search for things, knowing that I can search in Slack to see if people have dealt with this thing before. So just having that knowledge of, how would I have done this at my old job if I didn't know these things, kind of moving that over, that's really helped me out quite a bit.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. So, I think we've hit a good mark there. So, Colin, we want to thank you for joining us tonight and talking about dynamic properties and your experiences. Where can people find you online if they don't already know where to find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I am at Colin Odell. I also have a website I rarely update, but I'm trying to do better at, which is colinodell.com. And from those two places, you can find me pretty much everywhere else.
Awesome. Cool. Ben, last words.
Thanks for joining, Colin. It was really nice to see you at the Friendsgiving we had, Matt, that you were so close to and didn't come attend. So that was nice.
So anyways, we can edit this part out. No, Ben, why didn't I come? I had family in town.
I think you
What
were
the
in
hell?
Atlanta. You were like 1 hour
No,
away. And you're
I
like,
was
"Oh,
no.
I can't drive an hour."
Okay, first off, I was in Nashville.
I thought
And
you were
I
in Atlanta
had
for Thanksgiving. No.
no. We had my dad came up and like all of Kieran's family came down. So
Oh, okay. Okay.
we had like eight people, but then also like picked up some stomach bug type thing. So it was super fun. And then I got the booster on Saturday. So like on Sunday I was just out of it completely. No, I wasn't even near Atlanta for Thanksgiving, but I think I told you like we'll be down in Atlanta at the end of December.
I just won't get confused. I thought you were coming down for the holidays. So
We're coming down the 26th and staying through the 29th.
okay, yeah, we can meet up at some point then. We're going out of town
Yeah.
the day after Christmas, but we can do it before Christmas for sure.
I mean, well, we're good at Disney World next week. I don't know. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Anyways, we're gonna have to edit all of this shit out.
We don't have to either.
No, we don't. That pause was epic.
I liked it. We should just end the podcast right there.
Cool. Awesome. Colin, thanks so much, man. Really appreciate it. It's good seeing both of you guys back in October. Hopefully the next conference is not 2 fucking years away. Cool. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you guys later.
All right, guys. See ya.
Thank you guys.